Welcome to Light Within. We are so excited you're here.
But before we dive in, we'd love to ask you for a quick favor. We're a brand new podcast, and your hitting subscribe would mean the world to us. So please take a moment to hit subscribe, like, comments, and help our team bring this amazing content to you every single week. Thank you. And now back to the episode.
Andy, welcome to Light Within. It is such an honor to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Andy, you've been one of the most influential, most successful person in Silicon Valley. You were the early employee slash executive at companies like Facebook, Twitter, Wealthfront. You co-founded a investment firm and invested in companies like Robinhood and Webflow. Yet you decided to walk away from everything. You've shared that you walked away from tens of millions of dollars because you found a new awakening and new self. We'd love to just learn from you how it all started.
That's a good question. The origin of, I'd say, my inner search, my inner journey goes back to my late 20s when I had a sudden and mysterious onset of panic attacks. And what I now understand as the symptoms or the effects of obsessive compulsive disorder. I was actually working at Twitter at the time as one of the earlier employees. There was a specific day when I could just feel like something wasn't right. I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin. My mind was also just darting all over the place. It seemed like it was spiraling. I couldn't control where it wanted to go. And it was jumping towards all of these very terrible scenarios, images of myself and others being horrifically injured, for example. And it was just spontaneously happening. These are known as intrusive thoughts in psychology. It's one of the symptoms or side effects of severe nervous system dysregulation. But I didn't understand this at the time. All I knew was I was preparing to get on the train to head to San Francisco to go to work. And all of these horrific, sudden and spontaneous thoughts were jumping around in my mind. My body was flushed with panic. And I just felt as if I was unraveling. Nonetheless, I got on the train, went into work, walked to the office. I was there for all of about maybe an hour or two, sitting at my desk, trying to contain the panic that I felt on the inside when I could feel like I was on the verge of just having a breakdown. And so as to not grab attention, I very quietly grabbed my laptop, grabbed my stuff, and just walked out of the office and made my way back to the train, got on the train, pulled my hoodie over my head and sort of buried my face in the corner of the train and just cried and cried and cried. Later on that day, I was overcome with so many intense emotions that were flowing through me that I felt like my life was in danger. And I didn't know what was going on. I just was just completely swept up in whatever was happening to me emotionally and psychologically. And that's when I reached out to a therapist and began therapy. That was when I was 27. I'm 42 now. And over the next roughly 10 years, I played the game of pushing the beach ball underwater, meaning I think a lot of people can relate with this. There's something inside them that feels like it wants to emerge. It could be an existential dread or fear. It can be a sense of meaninglessness. It can be a depression and anxiety, an ocean of uncomfortable feelings potentially attached to memories we'd rather forget. And those things tend to try and arise in our life at certain times when our body feels like it's capable of maybe addressing that old pain. And for the next 10 years, while building my career and staying obsessed with work as a proper workaholic, I was in and out of therapy, pushing the beach ball underneath just long enough to keep growing my professional ambitions until eventually in 2020, things just reached a point where I couldn't push that beach ball underwater any further. And I said, like, something meaningful and significant is happening. I feel on the verge of undertaking a massive change in the trajectory of my life. I don't know where this is taking me or why it's happening, But all I knew is that the internal suffering that I felt was too great to endure anymore. And so that's when I left Silicon Valley, stepped off of all the board seats and all the things I was engaged in, and stepped down as a partner at the venture capital firm and left it all behind. I'm now 4.5, nearly 5 years removed from all that and have deepened into that inner search. But that's where it all began.
Before you had those intrusive thoughts, did you know that something was wrong inside?
No, everything was great, actually.
Oh, wow.
And that's the thing about trauma, childhood pain, is I eventually realized how much of what was coming up through the forms of these mental health symptoms I was having had its roots way, way back into my childhood. And in some cases, actually to the moment of birth, because my birth was, I almost died during birth. So that left an imprint on my nervous system as well. But there was a point, and I could share more details about the early years as well. But my mom passed when I was 10. It was a very tragic situation. She suffered from her own mental health issues stemming from severe childhood abuse, and that eventually contributed to taking her life. And when I reflect on the years and the months after that, there was a lot of pain in the years prior to her passing and a lot of just very, very difficult moments for any child. And then there was a lot of grief and a lot of sadness and shutdown that happened after she passed. But at some point, the body and the mind took over. I think in these instinctual efforts for the organism to survive, the body has this immense intelligence, and it'll just search for things that will help it survive, whatever that may be. And in my case, it latched on to achievement and perfectionism and workaholism. Eventually, that helped me sort of bury the pain. And it went underground for quite a while. I had an amazing high school experience, a great time in college, and then I managed to go on and begin building a really nice career. But emotional pain is patient and it's also wise. It may lay dormant until sometime later in life where you might actually be in a position to confront it, and then it comes up.
I feel like what you did is so hard to do. Walk away from something that you spent your whole life building. What was the turning point that led you to make that really bold decision?
It was really the accumulation of multiple things. Not only did I have these panic attacks, and they sort of came and went throughout the years, and I had periods of more acute anxiety and dealing with some of the effects of obsessive compulsive disorder, just a general state of internal dysregulation. So there were many moments of flare ups throughout the years, and each one of those kind of chipped away at the armor of sort of my resilience and the veneer I was wearing. When I was 35, I'd become the president at Wealthfront. The plan was in about a year for me to become the CEO so that I could run the company eventually through an IPO or a large acquisition, something like that. So I had that clear path in front of me, but then I had a sudden heart attack scare one day, and I ended up taking a 2-month leave of absence just to figure out what was going on with my heart, because I got a call in the middle of the day from the Stanford cardiologist or from one of the nurses saying, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm at work." And they said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Stressed." And they said, "Well, you need to go to Stanford emergency room right away." And they threw out some technical jargon. And I said, I don't know what any of this means. And they said, "Well, we're concerned that your heart may just stop." And so I said, "All right." So I hopped in a car and drove to the emergency room and admitted myself, and took those 2 months to try and figure out what was going on. And then when I came back, I knew, I was like, no, if I'm going to sign up to be the CEO of this company, I need to be able to do that for at least 5 years. And there's no way that I could take that risk. So I just had so many of those experiences, and me being a combination of hard headed, resilient, obsessive, all those things came together where I resisted for as long as I could until that inner knowing just grew and grew and grew and grew. And then eventually I was in a very dark place, and I said, like, I can't do this anymore, and placed the first phone call to initiate the process of stepping away from it all.
Andy, I really resonate with your story because when we moved from Korea to the US when I was just 8 years old. Our dad actually abandoned our family. And because of that experience, I felt like my mask was also ambition and success and working really hard. And just hearing your story makes me a bit emotional, to be honest,
Hmm.
because everything feels fine, but there are dark thoughts. So when you finally made the decision to really let go of your identity of being the ambitious person, like what was going through your mind?
In the moment, it was mostly the dark thoughts. It was mostly just profound inner sadness, a feeling of misalignment that my external life, although recognized and admired and appreciated by a lot of folks, including myself, I was proud of what I'd accomplished given where I'd come from. And it just took a lot of hard work and risk and stick to itiveness. But that in alignment, that misalignment was so great that I couldn't really understand it at the moment, but I could feel it. The mind tries to connect the dots and come up with some perfect story that explains through the analytical abilities of the mind of like what's going on. But all I knew is the message was simple. It was a felt experience of I don't want to do what I'm doing anymore. So leaving it aside or moving away from it at first was a very scary experience. Because, yeah, I'd worked up to a point where I was now at the maximum earning potential. And if I just spent 5 or 10 more years, truly like 30 years worth of prior work and effort as a top student and then a top school and then into tech and into all of that was like turning around and saying, no, thanks. I'm not going to accept the prize at the end of all this effort. So it was very difficult and loaded with fear and uncertainty. In retrospect, it's the greatest thing I've ever done for myself because what it was, truthfully, was me acknowledging and accepting, surrendering to the fact that this persona of a high performing, high achieving person that I had constructed as an adaptive mechanism to help me survive through very, very difficult years when I was young, it had served its purpose. I had made it. I was safe. I had given myself a secure future. But that very thing which had saved me had run its course. And it was time to let it go. But it didn't want to let go because that's who I thought I was. And it was so deeply entrenched into the psychological architecture of myself, of my identity. And so it was actually allowing that protective persona to fall apart and to disassemble it so that something else could emerge, which is the thing in me that really needed to be cared for and needed to be healed some and wanted to be heard. Call it my soul, call it the authentic self. You can call it whatever you want. It's the real version of us underneath all the socialization of life, underneath all the conditioning that we receive from the adults in the world and through education and everything else. And underneath the adaptations formed in response to the difficult periods of life lies an essential version of who we are. And so walking away from it was moving away from the old persona and moving towards the essential version of it. I just didn't realize it at the time. At first, it's all the negative stuff until later on it becomes more positive.
And just so listeners are aware, did you calculate how much you walked away from?
Oh, yeah. Well, in some cases, I know. In some cases, I know specifically. There was a moment when a CEO of a large company flew to the Bay Area to meet with me, and he did the classic, like we were just sitting over coffee. I knew he wanted me to work for him, and he slid a piece of paper over to me, and it was a blank contract. And he said, "How much do you want? How much do you need?" And I was like, "I don't even know how to answer that." And he wrote 40 million. And in the structure of his company was they would give you a certain number of shares that would, no matter what, equate to a fixed dollar amount. So it was a guarantee. And I sort of looked at it and said, "I think I need to talk to my dad." It was like, what? I couldn't compute. And so he scratched it out and he wrote 60 million. And uh,
What?
he said, "How about that?" And so I had turned that down. And then there's a high probability that had I continued on the investing side, or a reasonable probability that like a low end estimate is probably 10 or 20 million, and a high end estimate is, I don't know, 50 or 100 million, something like that. And I don't have nearly as much as that, but I'm very happy with what I earned and saved and invested. And so I have no complaints. And I tend to not think about that money very much because I had gotten to a point where I just knew it didn't matter to me. An extra incremental dollar wasn't going to improve the quality of my life any further. And I could feel that anytime one of my partners would say, "Yeah, man, you can make 50 or 100 million bucks. It'll take about 10, 12 years, but you'll make it." And I remember just feeling like, I do not care. Probably a sign of a bad venture capitalist, because a venture capitalist job is to turn a profit, And so I was like, yeah, I probably shouldn't be in this job anymore because I don't care. I'm not motivated by money that much.
Andy, I just want to say I really respect you. I respect you even from being at the top of a executive, being a top investor, but more so being able to walk away from all of that because you know what you needed and you weren't influenced by what other people were saying is just it's so inspiring to me. So I just wanted to
Uh,
really say that.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it was tough, but in some ways surprisingly easy. I don't know. It was weird.
How
It's
did
weird.
people respond when you walked away?
Well, that one CEO basically never spoke to me again. Previously, I'd had dinner at his house and stuff like that. It was all part of the courting process, but that's okay. I understand. He wasn't used to losing in that way, I guess you could say. More broadly, my experience with sort of having this persona within tech world that people picked up on from LinkedIn or whatever, this professional identity. And then all of a sudden, it's still me in the same form, but the things that I'm saying and expressing drastically changed to where then I'm talking about God and transpersonal psychology and all these more esoteric things that have nothing to do with my prior identity. In my mind, it produced like a bimodal sort of response where I had some friends, some people that I knew where then they like very quickly shifted away from me because what I was now talking about and representing wasn't consistent with the purely professional, profit oriented,
Mm.
success oriented identity that they had. And so it was almost just like, get that shit off of me. But the other side of the bimodal shift was that then there were people who like gravitated towards me because what I was saying and expressing was something that they could relate with. And they just really appreciated the authenticity within a professional atmosphere or professional container where typically that stuff is like just completely not recognized. Or if it is, it's viewed as predominantly negative thing.
I can definitely affirm I was one of those people. I very quickly noticed kind of what you're posting, hearing about your journey, and I was very much feeling connected in some ways, even though, we talked a long time ago and haven't connected since, but I felt that connection from you and your soul just desiring to share about your journey with others. That truly meant a lot. And I'm sure even if people haven't directly told you that, many have been feeling that way.
I appreciate that.
What part of your soul came back when you let go of the money and really stayed authentic to yourself?
Yeah, I didn't even realize it was a soul thing for a while, but there was a moment where it very clearly became a soul thing. The way I express it was I started on a mental health journey in a very Western psychoanalytic sort of frame, talk therapy, a little bit of exposure to different forms of trauma therapy to try and process some of the old traumas, but very much in sort of analytic, diagnoses based framework. Like, hey, you have complex PTSD, you have obsessive compulsive disorder, and sprinkle on top of that just generalized anxiety. Right? So you're an anxious
You
person,
got all of
maybe.
it.
Yeah. I was like, that's a lot of letters, you know? And so at first it began in that frame, and then in the language of, yes, this is probably a chronic disease. It's something that you need to deal with for the rest of your life, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And feeling like very broken, like as if I had significant deficits or dysfunctional sides in myself that needed to be repaired but might not be repairable. And it still came with a lot of benefits. And so, although it may sound predominantly negative in terms of my orientation towards Western psychotherapy, I still view it as a positive thing, but I view it as something that is of limited benefit. And if somebody wants to transcend the superficial layers of themselves and properly do a deeper excavation of themselves down to the level of soul, then it requires very different tools than talk therapy. It actually requires to leave those tools behind. It started as this psychotherapy path, and then it crossed this invisible line into predominantly spiritual experience. Or I should say, some folks are like, well, spiritual is a very loaded term. I'll say a transpersonal experience where I was still having like the human element, but I was also having these experiences that were non ordinary states of consciousness that defied rational explanation, that aren't identified in the DSM, the library of diagnostic criteria for mental health, but were profoundly transformative and would fit more neatly into what you could call mysticism, or these sort of esoteric experiences. And there was a moment where, this is early 2021. And so a few months prior to that is when I moved out of Silicon Valley, quit my career, and really just dropped into this dark descent, because then I had removed the dominant stimuluses in my life that were really effective ways for me to avoid the inner pain that was there all along. And so I moved all these things aside. I'm in an apartment all by myself, back in a city, left all my friends behind. I mean, everything. And I had dropped into a very dark place. One of the things that I'd do in the mornings, and it was just out of an intuitive sense that I needed to start doing this, was as soon as I woke up, I would sort of sit up in my bed, start meditating. And as I would start meditating, I would just cry. I would just cry and cry and cry. A lot of emotion was coming through. In one of those meditations, as I got deeper into it, a month or two into a consistent morning meditation routine, going 20 minutes, then 30 minutes, then 40, then 50, then an hour, there was a moment where I had a sudden and significant self-realization, where the way I would explain it is as if I dropped into a deep enough meditation such that the sort of ego center of the mind was temporarily arrested. And so it's the ego defenses weren't there. And then up popped this sudden self-realization, where in my mind's eye, as I was meditating, it's like a collage of faces came up, of family members and friends and all these people I knew, and including myself, where then I can suddenly and clearly see the prevalence of addiction within all of them,
Mm.
including myself. And I opened my eyes and said, oh shit, I'm an addict. And realized it's like I put aside the denial mechanisms of the mind and realized, like, wow, in all of these ways, I've been at a minimum just compulsive drug use or compulsive this, compulsive that, compulsive work. All of these things were now negative experiences in my life. They were bad for my overall well being, and I had an inability to stop them, which is sort of the basic definition of an addiction: negative outcomes, but an inability to stop. And then with that sudden recognition and seeing it in this entire social circle around me is like all of a sudden I had an x-ray and I could see people much more clearly. Also came a mountain of shame, all of the shame which sits hidden beneath compulsions and addictions. It all came up. I just spiraled for a couple of days, and I'm just down in the dumps, alone, separated from all these things that used to be my compulsions to avoid pain. And I'm sitting at my home office. I'm facing a window that's pointed to the west. And I'm just typing away, literally sending some of my last emails to officially conclude everything, my career. And I suddenly feel this intense presence, like my whole body lit up. Like I could feel that there was something there with me, although not in a visible spectrum, but there was something there. And my body lit up like a radio receiver. And just a flood of energy. And that presence, I felt this compulsion to stand up. So I push my chair back and I stand up and I'm looking out the window facing west. And it was a nice day and there are a few clouds in the sky. And then this light comes beaming through the clouds right at me. And I just broke open, transfixed, staring at this light and the tears just pouring and pouring. Meanwhile, my whole body, and I can feel a bit of it right now, my whole body is just lit up with that energy that gives you goosebumps. And that same presence compelled me to drop down to my knees and surrender. And I did. I dropped down in prostration, put my head on the ground, and I wept and wept and wept. It's kind of a blur around that. I don't remember too much shortly after, but I remember sort of coming back online, so to speak, within a few days where my memory and everything starts to return and being deeply at peace and being extremely present in a way that I'd never been before. And with a mind that was clear and not busy and not occupied with constant thoughts. I found myself just in states of bliss for no reason at all. I'd sit on the couch doing nothing and I had this big stupid smile on my face. And I'm like, oh, what happened to me? What just happened? And my sense of identity was fundamentally transformed by that experience. And my view of the world was instantly changed. And it felt like I saw the true nature of reality for the first time. I can recall going into a restaurant not too long after that just to get lunch, sitting and looking around and having this very clear felt experience that it's as if all of us were actors on stage playing a character, but nobody knew it except for me. And this sort of dissociation from my old identity and this dissociation from my old viewpoint of the world. And something happened in that moment of grace when something transpersonal, something divine reached out to me, touched me in one of the darkest places of my life, and initiated a process that has continued since then.
After that experience, did you ever fall back into the darkness?
Yeah. I'll use the generic term, a spiritual awakening, for what that was. It's very common. What happens is there is a temporary state of, call it enlightenment, very loaded term, but let's just use that. And there's that dissociation from the old identity. And then as a result, all of the weight, the psychological weight that comes with an attachment to that identity is then alleviated, it's released. So then there's this great lightness because it's, yeah, I'm Andy, I'm here, I have a human form, but there's much less of an ego there now than there used to be. And so it's like, yeah, everything's great. It's real easy. But that state is, as some would describe, some spiritual teachers would say, it's non-abiding. It's not a sustained state, or it's not an abiding state where then you remain in that enlightened state. And most who undertake this form of a spiritual transformation, you get glimpses of it. And then you're cast back into the everyday human experience, and your consciousness kind of drifts back into its old forms of attachments and its old styles and everything. And that's part of the process, though, because basically what happens is you get a glimpse. You're like, oh, I'm not who I thought I was. Neither are any of these people. Oh, I'm actually seeing reality more clearly. But then that's the introduction to then really having to turn inward and confront the shadow, so to speak. And that's when the hero's journey truly kicks off from there, where then I had several years of going through a lot of dark times, confronting very difficult old experiences and realizations of myself, and allowing a huge amount of old pain to be felt and released. I'm still, from time to time, I go through those waves. Most recently, had perhaps the most intense one of my entire journey, but I'm in more of the peaceful aftermath because I guess the way I describe it is it's once this mental health, spiritual journey, this inner undertaking, once it's really truly at hand and it's being played out, it's a recursive cycle of death and rebirth, death and rebirth, death and rebirth. Through those recursions, through that, every time you re-encounter the sort of death stage of it, there's a release that has to happen one way or another. And those are some of the harder periods. And I just had a pretty significant one, but not the first time.
I'd love to learn more about your significant one.
Yeah, it's been a trip.
What would you say is the hardest part of being on this journey?
Surrender, meaning it's possible, and we have to be open to this, and this is a big part of allowing the journey to unfold, is it's possible that there are forces beyond our perception that are at work in our lives. And in moments like that grace that I experienced that day, that lifted me up at a time when I was very, very down, it's possible that those things have a plan for us. And that plan is different than the plan that the mind would like to have for us. The mind's thinking, yeah, I want to be in the beaches of Thailand and partying and doing whatever it wants to do. And that could lie in contradiction or in conflict with a path that is being opened up for you by something transpersonal that is working through you and on your behalf, trying to guide you towards something else, potentially guide you towards a work or a service that you will perform that's necessary for helping others. And the surrender comes in to surrender over and over and over and over and over again, shedding the layers of resistance that the mind holds. That could be shedding a layer of mental resistance that is preventing old pain from coming up and allowing it to be expressed and released. It could be the resistance of the mind to not want to let go of some profession in order to make room for something new that may be less lucrative or not lucrative at all. There are so many different forms of surrender, and that is the hardest part, is allowing that surrender to happen again and again and again. Yet it is also the most essential thing to be done throughout the entire process, letting go.
Well, Andy, I hope you know I have surrender tattooed on me right here.
Oh, nice. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the symbolism of this part of the tattoo. It's sort of a person surrendering to a higher power. That's why I have that one.
I feel like our understanding of surrender just changes as we experience life. In some sense, it's a very confusing term. Does it mean I shouldn't do anything and just meditate or pray? Or, does it mean, what does that mean? And I think what you're saying is truly discerning the path that nature is taking you on. And we as humans do everything we can to resist that, being open to that experience.
Yeah, that's the nature of the mind, because the psychological structure of the self wants to preserve itself. Any change that threatens its prominence or its dominance in your life, it can perceive as threatening to your survival. And so it resists change. And so it plays an important role for the purposes of survival, but it runs into conflict with this surrender thing, because in my scenario, for example, everything in my body said, quit, leave. This is not for you. You're going to die from workaholism if you stay here.
Mm.
And the mind was like, yeah, but what's going to happen? Maybe you won't get a job again. It just throws fear after fear after fear. That's all it does. It's just a fear machine, right? But you're totally right. It's like the surrender doesn't mean do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
In Western cultures, in particular, around rugged individualism, surrender is immediately interpreted negatively. And so it's interpreted in that way of like, what, quit, give up, do nothing? It's like, no. What it means is at first, it means to stop and observe. Like, where's the current of life actually trying to take me? What are the signs that I'm receiving about how something is ready to change, but I'm clinging on to it because the mind keeps throwing out fear-based rejections? Surrender means to stop and observe. And then when you identify the truth of what's happening, surrender means to accept the truth of that circumstance, the truth in that moment. And then based on the identification and the acceptance of what is actually happening, then you act. So action is still involved in surrender, but that's the process of it. So a good way to think about it, and this is really like a meta philosophy on life for those on the spiritual path. So they tend to think of like the spiritual path means it's a path where every day is full of practices. I meditate and then I do this and I do, and that may be part of it. Those spiritual practices can assist in the process of surrender, but the spiritual path it's a life led by spirit. It's a life where you're paying attention to where the current is trying to take you, understanding that something transpersonal may be carving that route for you. And it's asking you to just trust it and to go with it. And so the best metaphor that I've come across for it is like if you go whitewater rafting, they'll give you a quick crash course. Here's how to use the paddle and put on all your safety gear. And then they give you a safety check. And one of the safety checks is like, what do you do if you fall overboard? The thing that people tend to do reflexively is they fall overboard and they panic. And so they start fighting as hard as they can against the current. But the issue with that is that you're not stronger than the current. And it's when you resist the current that you exhaust yourself and that you end up in danger. And so the thing that they teach you to do is like basically you go mummy mode, right? So you wrap your arms across your chest and you just stick your legs out like you're a plank, like a wooden plank, and you just let the current take you. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to bump into a rock or this or that and take in a bit of water. You still will, but you go with the current and you conserve your energy. And eventually there will become a clear point in which you can safely get out. Or there's a branch there for you to grab, or the water softens and you can just literally walk right out. What we have to be open to, which is very, very hard to do in modern times where the intellect is so prized over anything else. And the construction of these like super identities, these really big, rigid egos is rewarded, it's celebrated. What we have to eventually be willing to do when life calls us into one of these deep transformations is let all that go and say, I'm not in charge. My task right now is to surrender to the current and see where it takes me, because maybe it's got a plan for me.
Surrender is something that I aim for. But what's really hard about surrendering for me at times is that I don't know what the right thing to surrender to is. How do you discern where or how to surrender?
Usually I look to what I'm clinging onto out of fear. Specifically, if I've realized that I'm habitually clinging on to something, like I'm refusing to let something go. Yet when I work on that thing, usually I'm trying to like effort my way through something, like force an outcome to happen. I don't realize it, but I'm clinging on to it. And it's my effort that is the form that clinging takes. But there's also, after enough efforting my way into that thing, an inner resistance builds. Something in me is saying, I don't want to do this. But this thing up here is saying, keep doing it because you have to push your way through this. Right? So it's this awareness around the felt experience of resistance, an inner resistance to something that the mind is saying I should be doing. And then the recognition, like usually I'll do that many times over, repeating that same cycle until I recognize, oh, I'm clinging on to this thing. And when I then think about letting it go, fear comes up. And that's when I know I'm like,
Mm.
that's the thing to surrender to. Surrender to the inner resistance. There's wisdom there. Surrender to the thing I'm clinging on to. There's fear there. Let them all go. Drop even further into the valley of nothingness that may immediately follow it, and then see what happens.
What happens after you surrender? What are you feeling?
Usually it's lightness, more peace. Sometimes it's definitely more uncertainty, feeling more detached, more fear. But eventually, once I fully integrate that surrender, yeah, it's just peace, balance. I'm in one of those phases right now where I went through a very powerful, painful series of surrenders recently. Been through quite a few very intense surrender moments this last couple of years. But what follows after that is, yeah, just more peace, simplicity. In the present moment for me, it's that voice in my head that used to always be striving, saying, I need to do this, I need to do that, I got to prove myself so that I'm worthy and lovable, and all the external drivers of feeling worthy. That voice is getting quieter and quieter and quieter. Right now, that voice is pretty quiet. I don't really feel like doing anything. And most of the time, the routine I have, like I have a few meetings here and there, a few coaching calls here and there, but most of my day is actually spent in self care and simple relaxation, laying in a park, doing nothing.
I think the truth about surrender is it's inevitable, I think, in some ways. You would resist it, as you said, but you would eventually run out, and your body's going to tell you, your relationships are going to tell you that things are not going the right way. And it is so painful to accept that the life you thought you were optimizing in the best way is not the life that you desire or even should be aiming for. What were some of those surrender experiences like for you?
Mm. Story time. Um, one of these was in, I think it was 2022, early part of 2022. I had been connected to a military veteran who had started an organization called Heroic Hearts Project. They're a nonprofit that they self-organized, run by a few veterans who had experienced tremendous healing through indigenous medicine practices, specifically psychedelic assisted spiritual work and mental health work, beginning with ayahuasca, which is native to the Amazon and in South America, Central America as well. Love the work that they were doing. I had benefited greatly in my own journey in processing childhood trauma with the use of psychedelics. And he asked me to join the board. And I wanted to say yes right away, but a part of me didn't feel like it would be authentic until I went and sat in one of these ceremonies with the veterans. So I followed that instinct and signed up for an upcoming retreat and flew down to Peru and made my way into the Amazon, where there was a shaman who had built this center and had been doing so for about 17 years, working with ayahuasca. Typically, the way it goes is you do it 3 nights in a row. So 3 ceremonies each night. You drink a bit of the medicine, you go through an experience, and then you just do it again, again, and again. On the first night, and I had done ayahuasca once before. It was a beautiful experience. It was one of the deepest feelings of love I've ever had in my life. Very healing experience for me. This was a very different experience. I drank my first dose. About an hour into it, I was waiting for the similar or familiar effects to kick in. Those weren't kicking in. And then this like question popped up in my head as I'm sitting there in sort of a meditation pose. And it keeps saying, it's like, am I there? Am I ready? Am I there? Am I ready? And I was like, I don't know what that means, but it's just going, going, going. Shaman comes over and asks, would you like another dose? And I hesitated, was like, I know how powerful this stuff is. I don't know. uh, and so I sat on it and I said, let me sort of meditate and appeal to the spirit of this thing and see if it guides me. And then eventually it's a very clear message said, yep, do another. I said, okay, take another. I sat through the whole ceremony having very mild effects, but no big fireworks. And meanwhile, everyone else is going through their experiences of various types. Ceremony ends at roughly 10 p.m. And we're all just laying on the floor of this hut in the jungle. It's pitch black, except we have one candle lit in the middle of the room, and people are back into their coherence and conscious state and talking and reminiscing. And then I'm sitting there thinking, like, well, I guess nothing for me this time. And then boom, it hits. I turn over, grab my bucket, I purge into it. I simultaneously out both ends. I'll admit that. I call it the great shart of 2022. It was such an intense experience that it even scared one of the veterans, who's now one of my buddies. And he's like, whoa, humbling experience. I felt no shame or humiliation. I remember thinking, like, oh, that's kind of a form of liberation. But anyhow, my journey started after everyone else's ended. For whatever reason, I was singled out that night. And from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., I went through a brutal experience and really intense purging. So much so that I burst the blood vessels in my cheeks and in my eyes. And so I had like burst blood vessels all throughout here and in my nose. Like when you purge that hard, the amount of pressure that's exerted, they just burst all these. I purged multiple times, and I went on this repeating cycle of I'm basically laying on the bathroom floor next to the toilet, going in and out of the experiences. I'm receiving insights and getting these very direct messages. And then I would purge, painful purge. And then I'd take a quick cold shower to try and like bring myself back together, and then back on the bathroom floor, and just over and over and over and over. And people are probably thinking, like, that doesn't sound like medicine. That doesn't sound like healing. And what I'd say is, like, you never know what you're going to get in any of these ceremonies. They're drastically different from one to the next, but it gives you in the moment exactly what you need without you even realizing it. And it was probably about 5 a.m. at this point, and I'm sort of in this like conversation with the medicine, with the spirit of it, so to speak. I'm like, okay, I get it. Yeah. You want me to go through this? Okay, I'm going through it. So I grabbed a pillow and I'm like, I'm moving into the bathroom. Like, I'm all in on this. This is what you want. I'm there for it. Surrendering and submitting to the process of it, as terrifying and brutal as it was. At one point, I'm laying there. I had received a few direct messages that ended up being very powerful insights that changed my life in the coming years after. But there was a moment where I'm laying there sort of half in and out of consciousness, so exhausted from the intensity of it that I'm close to passing out, but it would just kind of like jolt me awake. It was keeping me awake. And at one point I'm laying there, and then the words were spoken into my mind. The words said, "You must suffer as Jesus did." I wasn't a religious person prior to that. I was definitely opening up to the mysterious elements of the world, and the atheist in me was being dislodged. But I didn't have any particular strong religious affiliation. And when those words were spoken into my mind, I responded out loud, okay, I accept, I surrender, do your worst. I just accepted it. And I had a moment there laying on my back where I was kind of splayed out as if I was in crucifixion position. The next morning by 8 a.m., I slowly was able to pick myself up off the bathroom floor. The sun had come up. I realized that this ceremony was going to end for me when the sun came up. There was something in me that just knew this is going to go all night until the sun arises. Very symbolic. And as I made my way down the stairs towards where everyone else was eating breakfast, each step I felt a profound sense of being reborn. And the tears flowed and flowed and flowed. Yeah, that night it taught me the lesson of surrender, to let go. And I've since repeated that lesson of surrender and let go many times since, especially in the more powerful experiences I've had recently. But yeah, that's what it's looked like for me. Not everyone's path is like this. For whatever reason, my journey is punctuated by these very intense moments of
Mm.
a purification through some suffering and through a forced surrender. It has, as time has gone on, built a stronger relation to Christian symbolism and the Christian faith that is now sort of making its way into this stage of my journey. But yeah, that's one example. Big surrender.
When you mentioned life-changing insights kept on coming inside your head during that entire night, what were some of those insights?
Well, one was a very specific message that said, reach out to a specific person that I'd lost touch with, somebody I cared for. And we had a friendship, but we had drifted apart for a while. And 3 days, 4 days later, after I left the Amazon and boarded a flight to head back home, I reached out to that person. And the message I sent, I didn't have to think about it. I just knew exactly what to say. And when that person received the message, they were actually in the thick of a dark, suicidal depression. It reached that person at the ideal time. And I just said to him, you don't have to do this alone. And since then, we've reconnected. And over the last 4 years, we've been sort of co-pilots, so to speak, as I've been there for her and she's been there for me. And we've established we're now best friends. And I think I was given that message to reach out to this person at a time when they needed it most. I was given an assignment, if you will, to serve others. Also, I wondered for a long time, I was like, what is this message that I must suffer as Jesus did? What ended up following over the subsequent 2.5, 3 years was this growing infusion of mystical experiences into my day-to-day life, Christian symbolism. So, for example, one time I went to go and visit a Hindu meditation center. And right as I turned on the dirt road to get there, I had what Carl Jung would refer to as a synchronicity, which I've had dozens of these since then. They're like astronomically improbable coincidences. But I've had this one happen many times where right as I turn on the dirt road into the meditation center, I go to reach to my radio and the time flips over to 11:11. Seeing repeating patterns of numbers is a common form of synchronicities that people report once on the spiritual path. And the song on the radio immediately switched to Christ is King and started to play. And my whole body lit up in chills. And I paused and I said, oh, okay, message received. I've had many such encounters. Most recently, over the last year, what started to happen is certain times when I would drop into prayer and I would pray in a particular way, or most recently, when I would go to church, I would get transfixed by the symbol of the cross. I'm not listening to the pastor, I'm not reading scriptures necessarily, but something deep inside of me would become fixated on the cross, and I immediately could feel what it meant. The symbol of a person surrendering to themselves to something greater than themselves, the death of the self in service of something higher. Something in my psyche and my soul just understood that so deeply and could feel it that it initiates what I describe as basically a crucifixion type purge, where what happens is my heart starts pounding really fast. Eventually, my entire body begins shaking. Every inch of my body is shaking. Tears and a lot of emotion. The sense of suffering is pouring out. And then I could feel it building up in my stomach and in my chest until eventually there are really primal screams that come out. And when I scream in that really primal way, it's as if my mind just goes blank for a moment, as if some part of my psyche is dissolved and an emptiness follows. It would happen when I would contemplate the cross. It would happen when I would go to church. And this most recent one was on the last day of Lent, sort of marking the crucifixion and the conclusion of sort of the procedures of that symbolism. And my father said, hey, you want to go to church? And I was comfortable in bed. I was like, I don't know. And I said, what time? He said, oh, it's at noon. And I checked my phone and it was 11:11. And immediately my body lit up and I looked up and I said, okay, yeah, I'll go. As I'm driving to church, my heart is pounding. I could feel it coming. I'm like, oh boy, here we go again. Get into church, and as the ceremony is unfolding, the intensity of it's growing and growing, and my whole body is shaking. Tears, the intense feeling of energy in my body, and I realize the screams are coming, and so I'm like, I can't scream in church. And so I tell my dad, it's like, I gotta go, I gotta go, I gotta go. And I run outside, drop on to all fours onto the ground, and then just really intense. If you imagine the screams that would come out if one was dying a painful death. And that's the felt experience of it. That's why I call it these little crucifixions. It's these intense purging of martyrdom like suffering that happened for about 30 minutes. And then the next day it happened again for another hour as my dad sat with me and held my hand as my body just convulsing, all this intense energy moving through it and immense amount of suffering that I'm not even sure was just my own, as woo woo as that sounds. And then on Easter, on the day of the resurrection, it was bliss, peace, emptiness, a feeling of being reborn. And then Monday, it happened 2 more times, an hour at a time. Most recently, I had my last one last Saturday, or sorry, 2 Saturdays ago, about another hour of intense. Now, there are many ways to explain this. Western psychiatry would say, oh, that's a moment of psychosis. Medicate this person, tranquilize them, put them in a hospital. That's what they do to some people having what is known as a spiritual emergence. Christianity would refer to it as this is the Holy Spirit entering somebody, working through them, purifying them, preparing them for something. Hindu philosophy refers to this as a Kundalini awakening, an intense energetic process that would happen amongst some of the monks and gurus and what have you. Stanislav Grof coined the term spiritual emergence, spiritual emergency, as he was explaining these phenomena to the Western culture. Stanislav Grof being trained as a psychiatrist and having the medical training, but also somebody, he having experienced non-ordinary states of consciousness himself, saw that what Western medicine was doing in medicalizing and sedating people having these experiences was actually a profound misdiagnosis, that they weren't having a moment of psychosis. They were having an experience that, as painful as it looks and as overwhelming as it can be, is actually a deeply healing and transformative experience that many other cultures from around the world recognize and understand. Any culture with a recognition of shamanic medicine, as you find in Africa, as you find in all South America, as you find in indigenous cultures everywhere, they see this as a shamanic purge. Something is being released through you as a channel, and there's a reason behind it. And eventually you'll find out what it is, but it defies rational explanation. So that's what's been happening with me. As unbelievable as it sounds, I can't deny the very real mystical experience of what I've encountered.
What does it feel like to live day to day with Holy Spirit inside you?
Sometimes it's overwhelming. If you suspend a purely rational, materialist, scientific view of things and you open or welcome the idea that there are these really powerful transpersonal sources, call them sources of immense energy, the human body and mind isn't capable of holding and containing all of that. And so it works through you in waves. It's like it's upgrading your system to a better hard drive. But in those moments, those upgrades can be hard, very hard, intense, some of the most intense energetic and emotional experiences you can imagine. Other times it's just grace. It's just a light, calm, peaceful, grounded energy. And what it's given me is, as somebody who's spent his whole life doing in order to feel lovable, it's given me the feeling of just being, in that there's nothing for me to do in order to feel whole or to receive love or to be accepted by others. It's okay to just be as I am. There's no imperfections. Not that I'm a perfect person. It's just that every aspect of ourselves is intentional, including, I think, all the harder experiences I went through in my childhood. Some of the adaptations that I formed that would be viewed through a clinical lens as some sort of deficiency or some maldevelopment. None of that's true. I have an incredibly sensitive nervous system. It's part of the reason why I just am outside in a park most of the time. I have a hard time being around large groups of people. And as this journey has deepened, has intensified, because I've realized that, like, I can feel what other people feel and they don't realize it. But when I stand in the presence of somebody, I see and feel what's going on inside them. Psychology would say, well, yeah, you have an incredible amount of sensitivity because the childhood environment you grew up in requires that, required that you were very attuned to the dysregulated state of your mom. And it's like, yeah, it's absolutely true. Is that a deficiency or a maladaptation? Or is that all part of the divine plan? Yeah, it's also the superpower. So I don't want to change that part of myself. I have to protect it.
There's a reason why you're experiencing all the things that you're experiencing, and there's a deeper meaning behind everything. Where do you think God is leading you towards?
Ultimately, back towards God. But in the meanwhile, it's towards serving others. It's towards a calmer, more peaceful existence, one that is nurturing to me, one that doesn't require me to do more to feel better, but one where I actually get to take care of myself finally. And from time to time, when called to serve other people, I think that's exactly how this works and why these spiritual emergences and these phenomena need to be taken seriously and recognized, as many other cultures do, which is use the language of Joseph Campbell, the researcher and architect behind the hero's journey, in his amazing book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he outlines the great monomyth of the hero's journey, where you're invited into this call of this great journey. And if you answer that call, you descend into the battles, just slaying your inner demons, your inner dragons through this hero's adventure. And through the process of slaying one's dragons, there is the hero, in a sense, dies, not physically, not in their form, but the essence of who they were. It is transformed through that process of turning inward and facing our darkness. Some sort of mysterious alchemical transmutation happens that can't be described purely mechanistically through a scientific lens. It can't be explained entirely through that. It's probably better explained through the mythopoetic frameworks of history, of mythology, spirituality, philosophy, and religion. But what happens to the hero in this journey when they go to slay their dragons and a part of them dies in that process and they're transformed in some mysterious way is you come back with a gift. And that gift is what Joseph Campbell called the elixir of life, because that gift is something that you bestow on humanity to help humanity be reborn again in some way. And that's what allows us to shed our skin as a civilization and to continue to evolve and transform in a direction that is guided by something greater than ourselves. But that process can only happen if heroes answer that call and are willing to go to battle and to die, in a sense, through that process. And that's what's happened. Is the old achiever version of me, the version that was going to be a CEO of a big company and what have you, it's gone. Not the full essence of who I am. There's still parts of me there that have always been there. But those false attributes of myself, they've been shed. And a sacrifice has been made. I've sacrificed that old identity for the purpose of trying to support others in my own small way. sometimes through the essays I write, sometimes through conversations like this, sometimes through the serendipity of meeting somebody in a coffee shop and having a conversation with the person who needed to hear what I said in
Mm.
exactly that moment. So it's for service, for the purpose of helping humanity evolve and to heal. I now know a few hundred people personally who are going through their own version of the hero's journey. In almost every single case, for those who genuinely undertake that task, what's coming out the other side of it for them is somebody whose life is more balanced and peaceful. That naturally involves more self care and more nurturing for oneself. And that has prepared them and has revealed, it's been a revelation to them of what their gifts are in this internal sense that they want to share those gifts with others for the purpose of healing and transformation. And that's just how it works. Jesus Christ being the ultimate version of that, right?
Do you feel like you may know what your life might look like in the next 10 years?
No idea. I think so. I think it's going to look very similar to what I'm now doing, which is I spend a few hours here and there reading, writing, thinking about a message that I want to get out to the world. And now, when I get those messages out, like most recently, I somewhat spontaneously just felt this urge for this kind of bigger idea complex to come out. And I wrote the essay, just flew out. It's about a 25-minute read, so it's a pretty thorough essay. I shared it with no expectations, really. I thought maybe 10 or 20 people will like it. It'll help a few people. And then it just kind of took off, and 35,000 people have read it, a lot of them coming from Silicon Valley and finance, but truly from all over the world. And I just received hundreds of messages from people saying, I can't tell you how much this has helped me. And so I think that's going to be a part of it, of my life in the future, is I'll still write and express my thoughts and ideas from time to time whenever they emerge. Maybe I'll continue to do a bit more coaching. I'm contemplating going and getting a graduate degree in transpersonal psychology, heavily Jungian inspired, because a lot of the experiences that Carl Jung wrote about in his infamous Red Book, his sort of journal that he took documenting his own transformation over like a 4 or 5 year period in the middle of his life. In reading that, I realized, whoa, I'm having a lot of these experiences too. Like this, I'm not crazy. This stuff is real. And so I'm very interested in transpersonal psychology and Jungian psychoanalysis. So maybe I'll study that more, but we'll see. Otherwise, I just kind of want to like spend a lot more time in nature, do a little bit of exercise, but more of the stuff that's like nurturing to repairing my body. Spend more time with people, more time with animals, just see what emerges.
What kind of hope do you have for the world and people?
I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of optimism in the long run. As I mentioned earlier, this process of human development and personal transformation is a repeating series of deaths and rebirths. That's where surrender comes in. You got to allow the thing to die that you're clinging on to. I mean, that's consistent with the nature of all things. That's consistent with the nature of the universe. Everything revolves through these cycles of death and rebirth, just how things go. And it's as if humanity goes through its own cycles of death and rebirth. It's as if humanity goes through its own hero's journey. And there are times where that journey gets dark and it requires an individual, or it requires a collection of individuals to confront their shadow, to look at the darkness, to allow a part of itself to die so that it can be transformed, and to take the boon, the great gift of that experience, and bring it back to the world to be shared to help it renew itself. And my observation is that the process of transformation that the individual goes through is identical in sort of a sequence or in a rhythm as the process of transformation that civilization goes through, large groups of people. My sense towards the unrest in the world, the ideological divides, the growing sense of detachment that we feel from ourselves, the growing sense of detachment that we feel from others and from the natural world, And from the basis of reality itself, as well as the very obvious growing detachment from a spiritual relation to life. I think I saw recently that only 2% of people in the UK are citizens, or maybe it was in London, only 2% now attend church. And so, really, over the last 2,000 years, there's been this growing detachment from a spiritual orientation to life. And that's been replaced with a growing sense of the superiority of the individual identity, a narcissism, if you will. Because when you don't have an attachment to something greater than oneself, you still seek out a higher power because it's built into us. But we tend to anoint ourselves as king and queen, and we make ourselves the higher power. And so in the last 300 or 400 years, ironically called the Enlightenment, was the rapid acceleration into the rational, material, analytical, quantifiable, scientific lens of the world. And that's brought about great beauty. We understand the architecture of the universe a lot more deeply, and we've been able to develop technologies that are profoundly beneficial to people. But we've overshot the mark. We've gone so far into the material that it's come at the explicit exclusion of anything immaterial. It's viewed as old world silliness. And we've thrown the baby out with the bathwaters. It couldn't be further from the truth.
Mhm.
So it's just like an individual will experience the deepest level of healing and transformation once they descend to the depth of their soul, past the psychology of the mind, even past their subconscious patterns of behavior, but like deeply into their transpersonal essence. The same is true, in my view, for humanity, that for a deep transformation to occur, one in which the way civilization is structured and run, and our philosophical lens of the world and how we relate to our own environment, can only change in the direction of something that is healthier and more sustainable if humanity at large returns to a soulful way of engaging with the world. And so, what this all means for me is, and I have no way of knowing this for sure, this is purely an intuitive sense. And I could be very, very wrong. But I think we're in for a lot of conflict and a lot of turmoil at the scale of civilization for could be hundreds of years, a challenging period. Because I'm sure you guys get this sense too, all of our major institutions are being questioned because maybe many of the forms that these institutions have take, although they've served humanity really well, maybe they've served their purpose. And now it's time for them to transform. Our system of education being a good example. People are even bubbling this all the way up to our questions around our systems of economics and finance, capitalism as a whole. Everything is being questioned. And that's part of this big plan. I believe it's the beginning stages of deep transformation that humanity must go through if we're going to sustain ourselves on this rock. And like most personal transformations, you kind of have to fall flat on your face before the pain gets significant enough such that you're now ready to answer that call and to begin that journey of deep transformation. So, in the long run, I think there's great beauty and prosperity and abundance ahead for us that science fiction novels are best at capturing. But to get there, I think we're going to have to go through some form of a death and rebirth. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's inevitable. That's how the universe works.
What message would you have for our audience if you can give one piece of advice to help them find a light within themselves?
You have to make space for it to enter your life. When we're so preoccupied as we commonly are, you stay overwhelmed with busyness and with work and social media and all these distractions. There's no space, there's no emptiness through which something else can then enter. And like when I reflect on my own journey, it's no coincidence to me that some of these deepest periods of transformation happened deep into the valley between the mountains of my life. And so you have to be able to create space And sometimes that's done through a consistent meditation practice. That's inner spaciousness, the spaciousness between thought. Sometimes that's by moving away from a really busy metropolitan area and towards another place that's a bit more slow and quiet. Sometimes that's go sit in a Vipassana, a 7 or 10 day meditation retreat. Whatever it is, like in my case, it was all right, quit the career, leave it all, blow a big hole in the middle of my life and see what enters that void. But we have to create the space.
Mhm.
And it's very difficult. It's very uncomfortable, not only because of the practical realities of life, raising kids, making money, all these things, but because we're often afraid of what will emerge in that nothingness, the things we might have to confront. I don't know many people, I don't know really any, who have gone through a large period of change without making space for it to happen.
Mm. That's such thoughtful and important point that you're making is without that space, we can't grow into the person that we're meant to be because we just keep getting in the way of ourselves.
Without that space, there's no room for the prior identity to slowly dissolve,
Hmm.
right? Caterpillar weaves its own space, it creates its own cocoon, and then in the cocoon, it dissolves.
Well, I need to go make some space now. Wow. Andy, where can people find you?
Mhm. On LinkedIn, if you search for Andrew Johns, also on Substack, I have a newsletter there. It's clues.life.substack.com. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. I just have those two, and I don't use anything else.
We'll make sure to add that in the show notes.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom, all of your experiences that are truly so meaningful. I knew that this podcast was going to really transform my life, but this took it to a whole new level. So, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing it with the rest of the world.
Thank you guys. And likewise, I appreciate your openness and vulnerability and for providing the space for conversations like this to take place. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Hope that resonated with you.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and leave your thoughts and comments.
Your support means the world to us and helps us bring these conversations to you for free. We read every single comment and we would love to connect with you there. So go subscribe. Until next time, love yourself, be kind to yourself, and remember, your light is always within you.